Opening. In many systems of power, favor is usually understood as something positive. It suggests trust, approval, and closeness. When someone is favored, they are often seen as safe, protected, or valued by those at the center of authority. At first, favor feels stabilizing. It appears to reduce risk. It can even feel like a form of security, because attention from power is often interpreted as support. But when we observe how groups actually behave over time, a different pattern often appears. The same favor that brings someone closer can also make them more visible, and increased visibility changes how others respond to them. This episode looks at that shift, not as a rule and not as advice, but as a recurring pattern in human behavior. Across courts, organizations, and social groups, favor does not always remain neutral. In many cases, it slowly changes how a person is perceived. Observation. When someone receives favor, the structure around them adjusts. This adjustment is usually subtle. There is rarely a clear moment when attitudes change. Instead, the change happens gradually through small shifts in behavior. People become more attentive to what the favored person says. Their actions are noticed more quickly. Their presence carries slightly more weight in conversations, meetings, or decisions. At the same time, the environment becomes more alert. Others begin to observe the favored person more closely, not always out of hostility, but out of awareness. Favor introduces imbalance, even when it is deserved or well-intentioned. This imbalance creates uncertainty. People begin to reassess their own position relative to the favored individual. They may not consciously feel threatened, but comparison begins to shape perception. Questions begin to form quietly. Why this person? Why now? What does their closeness mean for the rest of the group? These questions are rarely voiced. Still, they influence behavior. Support becomes more cautious. Agreement becomes slower. Interactions become more measured. The favored person may not change their behavior at all, but the way their behavior is interpreted often does. Ordinary actions begin to carry additional meaning. Silence can be read as strategy. Confidence can be read as ambition. Favor increases attention, and attention increases interpretation. Over time, this can create a shift. Favor is no longer seen only as trust. It starts to look like influence. And influence, even when unintended, creates discomfort. This is the point where favor begins to change its role. It does not disappear, but it becomes unstable. What once protected now invites scrutiny. This shift does not require betrayal or failure. It emerges from proximity itself. The closer someone is to power, the more their presence reshapes how others feel about their own position. Favor, in this sense, is not just a reward, it is a signal. And signals, once noticed, change behavior. Machiavellian lens. When Niccolo Machiavelli wrote about power, he paid close attention to proximity. In courts and principalities, closeness to the ruler was never neutral. It brought opportunity, but it also brought risk. Those who were favored were not only elevated, they were exposed. In Machiavelli's observations, rulers relied on favored figures to carry out decisions, manage perception, and maintain order. These individuals often appeared trusted and secure, yet they were also the first to be blamed when something went wrong, and the first to be suspected when something felt unstable. Favor, in this context, was never permanent. It was conditional, and it depended heavily on how others interpreted it. Machiavelli noted that rulers often became uneasy when a subordinate appeared too competent, too admired, or too central. The concern was not always disloyalty. Often it was dependence. A ruler who relies too heavily on one person begins to feel less in control. From this perspective, favor contains a quiet tension. The more useful someone becomes, the more visible their importance becomes. And once that importance is visible, it invites attention from others in the system. Courtiers watched favored figures closely. They measured their access, their influence, and their tone. Any sign of confidence could be interpreted as ambition. Any sign of restraint could be read as calculation. Machiavelli described environments where loyalty was assumed only temporarily. Trust was practical, not emotional. Favor existed to serve stability, not to reward character. Because of this, favored individuals often occupied an unstable position. They stood between the ruler and the wider court. This made them valuable, but it also made them vulnerable. If something failed, they were close enough to be responsible. If something succeeded, they were close enough to appear threatening. In these systems, the ruler's greatest concern was not always betrayal. It was loss of control. Anyone who seemed to gather too much influence, even indirectly, could trigger suspicion. Machiavelli observed that rulers sometimes withdrew favor not because it was abused, but because it was too effective. When a favored figure became essential, the ruler's authority felt shared rather than singular. At that point, favor stopped functioning as support and began functioning as risk. This is why Machiavelli often described sudden reversals. Individuals who appeared secure could fall quickly, not because they changed, but because their position had shifted how others perceived them. Favor placed someone in the line of sight, and once in view, every movement mattered. The important detail in Machiavelli's observations is that this pattern was not driven by morality. It was driven by balance. Power systems seek equilibrium. When favor disturbs that balance, the system responds. In this sense, favor was never just personal approval. It was a structural force. And once it altered the structure too much, it attracted correction. Machiavelli did not describe this as unfair or cruel. He described it as common. Courts behaved this way because people behaved this way when authority felt concentrated or threatened. Favor, then, was not dangerous because it was wrong. It was dangerous because it changed how power was distributed and perceived. That is how favor quietly began to resemble threat. Modern framing, Greene. In modern discussions of power, this same pattern appears again, though in a different language. Where Machiavelli wrote about courts and princes, Robert Greene describes similar dynamics in organizations, politics, and public life. In The 48 Laws of Power, favor is rarely treated as stable. Instead, it is shown as something that creates reactions. When one person rises quickly or receives visible approval, attention follows. And attention rarely stays neutral for long. Greene describes environments where people who are singled out for praise or access begin to attract mixed responses. On the surface, they appear successful. Underneath, they begin to unsettle the balance around them. One recurring observation is that favor often changes how intentions are interpreted. Actions that once seemed cooperative can begin to look strategic. Silence can appear calculated. Initiative can be read as overreach. This shift does not require hostility. It grows from awareness. Once people notice that someone has special access, they begin to reassess how that access affects them. Greene often points out that power environments are sensitive to comparison. People rarely evaluate their position in isolation. They measure themselves against those nearby. Favor makes that comparison unavoidable. In this framing, the problem is not that the favored person wants more power. The problem is that others begin to imagine that they might. That imagined future is enough to change behavior in the present. Another observation that appears repeatedly is that favor can blur boundaries. When someone is too close to authority, it becomes unclear where their influence ends. Even if they are not directing outcomes, their presence suggests potential leverage. This uncertainty produces caution. People may withhold information, they may limit cooperation, they may wait longer before aligning themselves. None of this requires open conflict. It happens quietly. Greene also notes that favor can create unrealistic expectations. Once someone is elevated, they are often expected to perform without error. When mistakes occur, they carry more weight because they appear to confirm suspicion. In this way, favor increases both attention and pressure. Success is noticed, but so is deviation. The margin for error narrows. Another pattern Greene describes is how leaders themselves respond to favored individuals. Even when trust exists, awareness of dependency can create discomfort. Leaders may begin to question whether their authority is being reflected or redirected. This does not mean that favor disappears immediately. Often it remains outwardly intact while inward attitudes shift. Praise continues, but scrutiny increases. Access remains, but distance grows. Greene's framing highlights that favor operates less like a reward and more like a spotlight. It draws focus, comparison, and interpretation. Once someone is under that spotlight, their position becomes unstable. Importantly, this instability does not depend on wrongdoing. It arises from perception. Power environments respond not only to actions, but to what actions suggest. In this modern framing, favor quietly turns into threat not because it is abused, but because it changes how future possibilities are imagined. The presence of favor makes certain outcomes feel more plausible, even if they never occur. And in power dynamics, plausibility is often enough to trigger adjustment. Psychological Mechanism, Part 1. To understand why favor so often changes into threat, it helps to step away from courts, books, and titles and look at how people respond to position at a basic level. Humans are highly sensitive to relative standing. Most people do not evaluate safety or risk by absolute measures. They do it by comparison. Who is closer? Who is noticed more? Who seems to matter? Favor immediately alters these comparisons. When one person is favored, others begin to adjust their sense of place. This adjustment does not have to be conscious. It often happens automatically. The mind starts tracking differences in access, attention, and influence. This tracking serves a simple purpose. It helps people predict outcomes. Who might be listened to, who might be protected, who might be believed. As soon as favor is visible, prediction begins. The favored person becomes part of other people's calculations, even if they did not ask for that role. Their presence starts to influence how safe others feel speaking, acting, or aligning. This creates a subtle tension. The favored person may feel trusted, others may feel exposed. One psychological factor at work here is uncertainty. Favor introduces unknowns. People do not always know what the favored person knows, what they can influence, or how closely they are aligned with authority. Uncertainty increases vigilance. When outcomes matter, people pay closer attention to signals. Tone, timing, and behavior all become data. This does not mean people are plotting or scheming. It means they are trying to reduce risk. Another factor is projection. When people see someone rise, they often imagine how they themselves would behave in that position. These imagined behaviors are then projected onto the favored person. If someone believes power changes people, they may assume the favored person is already changing. If someone fears ambition, they may assume ambition is present. These assumptions do not require evidence. They feel plausible enough to influence behavior. Favor also disrupts group equilibrium. Groups tend to stabilize around predictable roles. When someone moves closer to power, those roles shift. Even small shifts can feel unsettling. The mind reacts to this by restoring balance. Sometimes this happens through distance, sometimes through skepticism, sometimes through quiet resistance. The favored person may sense this change without understanding it. Interactions feel different, responses feel delayed, support feels less certain. From the inside, favor still feels like approval. From the outside, it begins to look like advantage. That difference in perception is important. Power dynamics are shaped less by how someone sees themselves and more by how others imagine their future behavior. At this stage, threat does not mean danger. It means potential disruption. Favor signals potential, and potential, once noticed, changes how people position themselves. Psychological Mechanism, Part 2. Another psychological response that appears around favor is envy, though not in its dramatic form. In most cases, it does not show up as hostility or resentment. It shows up as comparison. People compare effort to outcome. They compare recognition to contribution. They compare proximity to merit. Even when these comparisons are fair, they still affect perception. Envy, in this sense, is less about wanting what someone else has and more about noticing that the balance has shifted. That awareness alone can change how people behave. Alongside envy, there is often something quieter: anxiety about dependence. When one person becomes strongly favored, others may begin to worry about how much influence that person holds over shared outcomes. Even if the favored individual has no such intention, the possibility feels real enough to matter. People generally prefer systems where influence is spread rather than concentrated. Concentration creates uncertainty. It raises questions about gatekeeping, access, and vulnerability. If one person seems essential, others may feel less secure. They may wonder what happens if that person turns against them, leaves, or changes priorities. This concern does not require distrust. It arises from structure. Dependence increases risk, and the mind responds by seeking distance or safeguards. Another factor is identity protection. People often tie their sense of value to their role in a group. When favor elevates someone else, it can quietly threaten that identity. This does not mean people feel replaced. It means they feel less certain about where they stand. To restore that certainty, people may redefine the favored person in less positive terms, not openly, but internally. This makes the situation feel more predictable. Confidence can be reframed as arrogance. Silence can be reframed as calculation. Access can be reframed as manipulation. These reinterpretations help people reduce ambiguity. They provide an explanation that fits the new structure. From the favored person's perspective, this can feel confusing. Their intentions have not changed, but reactions have. The environment feels cooler, more measured. This is often where people make mistakes in interpretation. They assume they have done something wrong. Sometimes they have, often they have not. What has changed is not behavior, but meaning. Favor changes meaning. It alters how actions are read and how motives are guessed. The final psychological factor at play is anticipation. Humans do not respond only to what is happening. They respond to what they believe might happen next. Favor suggests trajectory. It implies movement upward or inward. That implication alone can trigger defensive positioning. People adjust early, not late. They distance themselves before they feel threatened, not after. This makes the shift hard to trace because it happens before any visible conflict. By the time favor clearly looks like threat, the underlying responses have already been in motion for a while. This is why the transition feels quiet. There is no clear moment when things turn. There is only a gradual change in tone, expectation, and trust. Favor becomes unstable not because people are irrational, but because they are attentive to signals that affect their future position. Closing observation. Another way this pattern shows itself is through how responsibility shifts around favor. When someone is favored, they often begin to receive not only attention, but expectation. Others assume they are informed, aligned, or capable of influence, even if none of that has been stated. This assumption quietly changes how people behave around them. Questions that were once directed upward begin to pass through the favored person. Decisions are delayed while people wait to see their reaction. Silence is treated as a signal. Over time, the favored individual becomes a reference point. This can feel subtle, even flattering at first. It can feel like trust. But it also means that the person is now associated with outcomes they did not create. When something goes well, their presence reinforces the belief that they matter. When something goes poorly, their proximity invites blame, even if their role was minimal. Favor creates association. This association is not logical, but it is common. People tend to link visible figures to visible outcomes. The closer someone appears to authority, the more responsibility they are imagined to carry. This imagined responsibility adds weight to ordinary actions. A comment can feel like direction. A hesitation can feel like disapproval. Neutral behavior becomes open to interpretation. As this happens, people begin to manage the favored person rather than simply interact with them. They may speak more carefully. They may share less freely. They may wait to see where the favored person stands before revealing their own position. None of this requires distrust. It requires only uncertainty. The favored person, meanwhile, may not notice these shifts right away. From their perspective, relationships look mostly the same. The change is often more visible to others than to the person at the center. This creates another gap in perception. The favored individual experiences continuity. Others experience adjustment. That difference can produce quiet friction. People begin to feel constrained by someone who does not feel powerful. The favored person may feel confused by reactions that seem disproportionate to their intentions. This is one reason favor so often leads to isolation. As people become more cautious, interactions grow thinner, conversations become functional, informal exchanges fade. The favored person remains included but less connected. From the outside, this can look like rising influence. From the inside, it can feel like narrowing space. Favor has not been withdrawn, but it has changed how freely people move around it. At this stage, threat does not mean danger. It means pressure. It means that the presence of the favored person is now shaping behavior rather than simply participating in it. This is the quiet moment where favor stops being just a benefit and starts becoming a condition. Until the next observation.